without further ado, I'll introduce you to Chris Gardner.
Thank you, Ivan. What Ivan didn't mention is that I spent a little bit of time actually at Appuldurcombe's custodian, and I gave guided tours when I was a wee lad. And of course, with my journalism background, I've been writing a book. And here's a draft. It's not finished yet, but there's a few special people that I've given copies to so they can pull me up on anything that's incorrect or give me pointers and all the rest of it. So I've actually sort of taken some of my research here and I've adapted it for some of the monuments in this church, which I have looked at many times over the years and just wondered about the people that they commemorate and that they remember. And so while this talk is about the Worsleys of Appuldurcombe, I'm going to start with the most opulent tomb or monument just down the end there, and that's to Sir John Lee. And just show of hands, how many people are familiar with the monuments in this church? So a few of you. So what we'll suggest is afterwards, if you want to wander around and have a look at the particular monuments that we're talking about, feel free to do that. So Sir John Lee's one is right down there at the front of the church and right in the middle. And in the 15th century, there was a chap called Richard Fry who made Appuldurcombe House his home. And he leased the priory house that was there from the minories of the Order of St Clare without Aldgate of the City of London. So that was an order of nuns. And with his wife Agnes and their daughter Joan, they lived at what was the priory house at Appuldurcombe. And when Richard died without a male heir in about 1480, his widow became the wealthy matriarch of Appuldurcombe. Agnes's second husband was Sir John Lee of Moor in Dorsetshire, and he must have found the priory house as attractive as a new bride, because he settled there in 1486. Sir John was granted a 25-year lease of Appuldurcombe in 1498. So that was a lease from the nuns who owned it. As I say, they were London-based, and they owned the land and the house and everything that was there, but they leased it to Sir John Lee. And he used Appuldurcombe as a base from which to acquire more prime island land, adding Carisbrooke Priory, just opposite Carisbrooke Castle, to his portfolio of leasehold land in 1504. However, Sir John's lease was in blatant disregard to a 1488 law preventing anybody from holding farms, land or tithes worth more than 10 marks a year. So King Henry VII exempted Sir John from the law on November the 20th, 1505. So Sir John was a man with royal connections and royal favour. And I think the reason for the law that was passed was all about nobody becoming too powerful in his sort of medieval life. If you had a lord with lots of land, he obviously had an army to help protect it, and the bigger the land, the bigger the army, the more powerful he gets. And they didn't really want people fighting each other. So obviously the king trusted Sir John Lee. And when Joan's stepsister Anne Lee married Sir James Worsley in 1511, Sir John secured Appuldurcombe for the newlyweds. He took out a lease for 50 years on March 1st, 1511, or 1512, the record's a little bit vague. Sir John Lee and Agnes, his wife, are named in the lease alongside James Worsley, groom of the King's Robes, and Anne, his wife, for the consideration of £56, 13 shillings and 4pence per annum. Anne's sister, Isabel Lee, became a nun. Sir John also ensured priests at this church celebrated Mass for the souls of himself and his family. In 1520, Sir John obtained a licence from King Henry VIII to make the church's south transept, boasting a unique lily cross on which Jesus hangs through there, a chantry for his family, so a chantry chapel. Anybody that's not familiar with medieval practices, when you died, you would leave some money to support a priest or the church for saying prayers and holding Mass for your soul and the soul of your family. So that all happened in this little chapel here at the side.
That's the point of the carvings of the soul speech. The monks to say prayers for his soul and medieval power. As their spelling wasn't that good.
That's right. So the licence that we're talking about involved an endowment, some money, and the lily cross, of course, has become symbolic of Jesus' purity and his sinlessness. So So Sir John died in a horse riding accident at Appuldurcombe. He was thrown from his horse when it stumbled over a wild boar. Sir John's tomb is said to be the island's most impressive. It's topped with an alabaster effigy of Sir John, his feet resting on a boar. Do go and have a look at the detail. At the soles of his feet are what they call beadsmen, as Father John has just said, a pair of monks grasping their beads in prayer for the Lord of Appuldurcombe at the time. And his widow, Dame Agnes, presumably moved out of Appuldurcombe Priory House so as not to cramp the style of her daughter Anne and son-in-law James. That tax year, 1522, 1523, Dame Agnes Lee was of Week, spelt W-Y-K-E. Of course, now it's W-E-E-K as the general acceptance. It was recorded as a widow and the island's richest person. She was valued at £66, 13 shillings and 4pence, paying 6 shillings and 8pence in tax. Dame Agnes died in 1529. She was not buried in the same tomb as her husband, but under a stone a little below it. She's said to have died a very old woman. She had many richly coloured clothes, which she passed on in her will. And I should point out that I was invited to come and give a little talk here after I contacted Father John from New Zealand with a few questions about some of the tombs. Of course, I'm familiar with the church and I've been here many times, but I just wanted to get some details, and thank you for your invite. I should have said that at the beginning. It's lovely to be here. It's exciting. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sir James Worsley. And his monument is the one over there. You can see him kneeling in his armour with his wife behind him, and there are, I think you would call them prayer stools.
Yes.
And he was a favourite of King Henry VIII. And he literally put Appuldurcombe on the map. Sir James was born in 1491, the same year as the future King Henry VIII, and he left his family home at Worsley Hall in Lancashire to serve as a page at the court of King Henry VII. The transitional character from the Middle Ages to the Reformation is how he was described. There the young Sir James doubled as Prince Henry's whipping boy, since it was a capital offence to lay a hand on a member of the royal household. Whenever Prince Henry's conduct earned him a beating, his friend James would take it in his place. While sparing Prince Henry the rod may explain why he was such a harsh monarch, that's my suggestion, James did rather well out of the arrangement. Shortly after Henry VIII's coronation in 1509, he received a knighthood and was appointed keeper of the King's wardrobe. The Worsley family had been royalists since the time of the Norman conquest, coming to England with William the Conqueror and establishing themselves at Worsley Hall. One of Sir James's forefathers, Sir Elias de Worsley, was a crusader and fought many battles against the Muslims in Palestine. He was buried on the Isle of Rhodes. In 1511, Sir James was appointed military captain of the Isle of Wight for life, and a daily salary of 6 shillings and 9pence. 2 shillings for his deputy and 6pence each for 13 servants. He also became the island's sheriff and coroner before marrying Anne Lee, the daughter of Sir John Lee of Appuldurcombe. And this is how the Worsleys, who were at Appuldurcombe for about 300 years, obtained the lease on the land, and it became their prominent seat. Sir James was Henry VIII's favourite throughout his life. He received a gift from the King in December 1515. I turn given to James Worsley by the King's grace a coat of black velvet with guards of black satin furred with black coney, which is, of course, rabbit. So the King gave Sir James some clothing. Sir James received another honour, the role of Master of the Robes in 1520, after impressing Henry VIII at a 3-week-long pageant near Calais in France. Intent on overwhelming Francis I of France with his opulence, the King had Sir James erect a 320-square-foot palace and 800 pavilions made from gold filaments sewn with silk between a place called Guinness and Ardres, where he would meet the French king. Nearly 6,000 nobles and 3,000 horses participated in the great procession across the English Channel, which was said to be the most brilliant array of nobles the world had ever seen. The pageant, which became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, included jousting competitions and banqueting. But it came to an abrupt end on June 24, 1520, when Henry VIII was bested by his French rival in a wrestling match. Weeks later, England allied with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and declared war on France. Sir James responded to the threat of large-scale French invasion by building Worsleys Tower at Norton, west of Yarmouth, opposite Hurst Spit on the mainland. The tower, if that is the right word, was a squat octagonal structure about 19 feet high and 26 feet in diameter with a single entrance. It was probably single-storied, mounting artillery through the roof parapets and gun ports through the lower walls flanking the tower. Sir James intended the tower to defend the Needle's passage into the Solent. Sir James was also keeper of the lions in the Tower of London, which was presumably kept at the Royal Menagerie. Sir James and Dame Anne claimed the manor of Appuldurcombe, alias Priory of Appuldurcombe, for the Worsley family forevermore. I've mentioned the Priory a couple of times. So before the Lees and before the Fries, Appuldurcombe was a priory, and it was actually a French priory with one prior and two monks. That's how it started in 1090. And the monks from Appuldurcombe actually came to worship here. And the church was divided into two. There was a screen between the two, we call them transepts, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a screen right the way dividing the church, so the villagers were that side and the monks and their neighbours were this side.
So there we go. So the ordinary folk would come in one entrance and the monks would come in another. They worshipped together but separated.
The English would never like the French.
So on December the 17th, 1527, Abbess Dame Dorothy Comberford of the Minories of the Order of St Clare without Aldgate, this is the nuns again, granted the Worsleys the gift in fee farm. This is their own words. Basically, the perpetual lease of Appuldurcombe was for the consideration of £56, 13 shillings and 4p per annum. Upon payment, the convent promised to send a sealed and dated receipt. Sir James promised a one-off payment of 100 marks to the convent, which would be made the following Easter. Every successor of Sir James and Dame Anne would pay a death duty of £6, 13 shillings and 4p to the convent. At Appuldurcombe, Sir James and Dame Anne spent up as they repaired the old priory and erected new buildings there. As their landladies, the minoresses came under financial pressure. Sir James gave them £20 in cash. Also, in their great needs and necessities, he said, loaning them £80 to be repaid over 11 years at a rate of £6, 13 shillings and 4p. A mid-16th century Isle of Wight map shows a cluster of buildings surrounding a tower, which was probably never meant to be a literal representation of what was at Appuldurcombe, rather an indication that the estate was the island's foremost, occupied by its captain. Lords of manors like Appuldurcombe founded the English parochial system by building private chapels on their own land for themselves and the people of their manor houses. So Sir James died on September the 4th, 1538, in his 47th year. Requiem Mass would have been celebrated for Sir James at the family chantry until Edward VI's dissolution of the chantries in 1547. Sir James never lived to see the convent, and Appuldurcombe surrendered to King Henry VIII in March 1539 during the dissolution of the monasteries. The king granted Appuldurcombe to Richard Worsley, the son of his late childhood friend, at the customary rent of £56, 13 shillings and 4p. This continued to be paid to Queen Elizabeth I in 1583. Sir James followed his late father-in-law, Sir John Lee, as a farmer of Sheen by the space of 30 years, it said in a document. I will that there be sung in the house of Sheen for my soul 2 trentrals, and they to have for the same 20s. It probably makes more sense when you read it rather than say it aloud. He also remembered the minoresses of Aldgate, masses to be sung in at the minories, and they to have for the same. Then after the Carthusians of Sheen, he remembered his chaplain at Appuldurcombe, and he gave a donation to them too.
Substantial was one of the specific offices for the dead, which were banned later on, but it was a popular devotion at the time, yes.
So very much a thing that was done everywhere.
By all decent people.
Yes. So Sir James left, this is his word, my best torn velvet gown to be made in a vestment to All Saints here, and £20 to presumably his old parish in Wigan in Lancashire for vestments as well. And presumably he and Anne, who died in 1557, were pious churchgoers. The effigies on their tomb show them kneeling at prayer desks. Prie-dieu, I think is how it's said in French.
That's correct. Yes.
Well, we got that right. Above is a canopy showing 3 young boys holding shields and what is presumed to be Sir James's medieval tilting helmet hanging overhead. I just learned that it's not James, is it?
No, that was the idea until recently when it was examined, yes.
Now we get to Richard Worsley. That's this tomb on the far wall. Keep saying tomb, I mean monument, sorry. This monument on the far wall over here. Richard, I'm going to admit it, he's a bit of a hero of mine, and you'll find out why as I read you his story. And I've cut this down a bit from a very long passage in my book, but it's quite an amazing story. So in 1545, England stood at a crossroads, and the country's back was against the wall. Invasion was expected at any time from France. France was expected to try and take the island first and use it as a staging ground for an assault on the English mainland. And that's not the only time this has happened. Napoleon had the same idea, Hitler had the same idea. So we're right at the crossroads and right at the front line here on the island in medieval times, at wartime. So Richard Worsley of Appuldurcombe served king and country in the most desperate hour. As a dashing young captain of the island, appointed by Henry VIII in 1540, Richard commanded the Isle of Wight militia. The military force was raised from the island's 9,000 strong civilian population to complement the regular army in times of emergency. Kind of like a medieval dad's army. The Isle of Wight militiamen were armed with long pikes topped with a billhook, daggers, knives and clubs, and women were armed with Welsh longbows. Militia service was compulsory for all islanders except the very young and infirm. Under Captain Worsley, who quickly earned a reputation as a capable and energetic commander, the Isle of Wight militia was ready to take up arms to defend Mother England from an invading force. They would fight for their very lives, their homes, their country, and their king. By the time the French war fleet set sail for England, Captain Worsley had already stationed watchmen, torches in hand alongside a series of beacons on the island's highest downs, Appuldurcombe included. The first sign of trouble, the beacons would be lit, the first in a chain of blazing fires that would both call out the militia and raise the alarm across the country. But England was ready long before the beacons were lit. The beacons were lit at the first sign of French sail on Wednesday, July the 18th, 1545, as Captain Worsley and his troops nervously watched the large French fleet appear on the horizon. There were 160 large ships, heavily defended with anti-personnel guns, archers and soldiers. They were supported by 50 smaller warships. Among the smaller vessels were 25 slave-powered galleys, each boasting a powerful cannon in their bows. And they were capable of landing, like a World War II landing craft. They could come right onto the beach. Admiral de Arnabout's war fleet arrived at Nab Rocks, 12 nautical miles east of Bembridge at about noon and dropped anchor. The French admiral divided his fleet's galleys into 2 forces. 4 were ordered to row ahead as scout ships, while the remaining 21 awaited further orders. 2/3 of the English fleet, 40 ships, so very, very outnumbered, sailed out of Portsmouth Harbour to engage the invaders as the English king watched from the safety of the battlements at Southsea Castle. The engagement lasted into the night. The French ship, the Maîtresse, sunk near St Helens as a result of grounding at Honfleur as it came out of its own port. So it took on water throughout its journey and sank. Come the dawn on Thursday, July the 19th, Admiral Dunabelt ordered the galleys to draw the English fleet out from behind the Spithead sandbanks. A sudden gust of wind caught the Mary Rose, and she heeled heavily to the starboard. Water rushed in through her open gun ports, and she sank with the loss of all but about 40 of her 700 crew, including Vice Admiral Carew. The king was distraught. "Oh, my pretty men, oh, my gentlemen, drown like rattans," that's what he said. Admiral Dunabelt tried to draw the English out by ordering attack that afternoon on the Isle of Wight. The strategy was the oldest one in the book: divide and conquer. This would be accomplished by landing at 3 locations on the island, sending landing parties to St Helens, Whitecliff Bay, and Monk's Bay near Bonchurch. The invasion might draw the English fleet into open water, where the French Armada would pulverise them. Captain Worsley, Richard, and the Isle of Wight militia were not only ready and waiting, they also had help from their countrymen and the women too. On Culver Down, Captain Worsley and Sir Edward ordered their baggage horses shed their loads, mounted them, and charged the French attackers with an impromptu cavalry. French intelligence the following morning suggested a French victory was unlikely, so Admiral Danabart ordered a retreat. As the French war fleet withdrew from English water, galley commander Chevalier de Hulps, Pierre de Blacas, led another landing party. Sir John Oglander of Appuldurcombe House, who was a friend of the Worsleys, wrote about 100 years later, they were nevertheless suddenly attacked by Richard Worsley, captain of the island, and driven to their ships with the loss of their commanding officer and many of his men. Sir Richard Worsley claimed much later in his History of the Isle of Wight, published in 1781, and we'll talk about him later. There's lots of Richards in Appuldurcombe's history, and you can get them mixed up. So, as de Blacas' company fled, he being shot in the knee with an arrow could not fly, whereupon some country fellow, I can imagine him no better, he calling for ransom, clove his head with his brown bill. He was as brave a man as any amongst the French, and captain of the galleys, for whom there's much lamentation. And that was an account from a French person who recorded what happened on that day. All Captain Worsley held dear would likely come to have been put to the torch if the French invasion had succeeded. His home, for now, was safe from the French. And actually, I don't think I've got it in these notes, but it's interesting to note at this time on the island, there were military forces posted all around, and the most populous one was, of course, Newport as the capital market town on the island. I forget the numbers, but this is all recorded in Worsley's History of the Isle of Wight. I think it was something around 500 soldiers based at Newport. Appuldurcombe was the second biggest garrison of troops. I think they had something like 400 by comparison. And then you go on further down and there's smaller numbers, 200, 150, you know. And it's hard to believe now when you look at the place and see where things are at, but when you think of it as the home of the captain of the island and the military commander, and, you know, the word captain and governor is interchangeable throughout the island's history, it's the same thing. But at time of war, he's the person where the rubber hits the road, and he's calling all the shots, and he even gets to command the professional soldiers as well as the local militia. So Richard, that we've just been talking about, Captain Worsley, oversaw the construction of Yarmouth Castle in 1547, possibly on the site of a church destroyed in a French raid in 1543. Stone from the old choir abbey, which Henry VIII had dissolved in 1536, was most likely used in the castle. Part of a crucifix wielding statue could be seen embedded in the castle wall. Captain Worsley was the King's Commissioner, selling the seized Roman Catholic Church property and depositing the cash in the royal treasury. So he's a devout Anglican. Further Worsley forts appeared at West and East Cowes, either side of the mouth of the River Medina, which leads to Newport, of course, as well as at Sandown, protecting the southeast coast. After seeing off the French in 1545, Richard armed the island militia with firearms. Also, each island parish church was provided with a falconet of brass or iron cannon. On muster days, horses from local farms were responsible for drawing the gun carriage. Richard swapped his role as captain of the Isle of Wight in 1553 for a stint in court as a justice of the peace, but he was reappointed captain of the island in 1560 for life, spending the rest of his days surveying the defences of Portsmouth and the Channel Islands. He died on May the 12th, 1565. In his will, he asked to be buried here at Godshill near his grandfather, and left numerous minor bequests, including a piece of unicorn's horn to Sir William Pickering and a gelding to John Astley. Appuldurcombe was left to his widow, Lady Ursula, and provided for their two infant sons, John and George. But France, ironically, ended Captain Worsley's direct line without firing a shot in 1565. Captain Worsley's widow, Ursula St. Barr of Ashington in Somerset, held the ample Appuldurcombe estate for her two young sons after the husband's death. To be raised at Appuldurcombe in the 1550s and 1560s was to grow up looking over your shoulder for French invaders, as the two young sons of the departed captain of the island knew. John Worsley, 9, and George Worsley, who was 8, would have grown up with tales of their father's exploits against the French invaders. The Appuldurcombe heirs were attending school in one of the estate gatehouses where servants were also preparing for a military exercise, the muster. Appuldurcombe's gunpowder supplies had got wet and were no longer explosive, so the decision was made on September the 5th, 1567, to dry the gunpowder near the lodge's fire. Young John and George were killed in the ensuing explosion. This is Sir John Oglander's account. He says, "Being in ye lodge of Appuldurcombe, the servants were drying of powder against ye general muster. A sparkle flew into ye dish that set fire to a barrel that stood by her, blew up the side of ye gatehouse and killed ye 2 children, 8 and 9 years of age." Sir John Oglander learned of the explosion from James Worsley, who was injured in the explosion, and had often told me this story, he said. Sir Captain Richard Worsley also fathered an illegitimate child whom he sponsored through school in Winchester before setting him up on a farm at Chale. Thomas Worsley of Chale was begotten by Mr. Richard Worsley of Appuldurcombe on the body of Uri Target's daughter, who dwelt at Godshill, Sir John Oglander wrote. So then, we move on to Sir Robert Worsley. It's quite a jump. I'm kind of focusing on the major players in the Worsley story and in the Appuldurcombe story here. In my book, I've got details of everybody else as well. But there's a massive monument through here, which was Sir Robert built for himself. So he's the 4th Baronet of Appuldurcombe. He's born in, I'm quite sure what that date is. He died in 1747, aged 77 anyway. And he inherited Appuldurcombe when he was just 7. And the house that he inherited was regarded as a bit of a throwback from another era. Fashions were changing, and the ageing house, which looked like a hodgepodge of buildings that had been thrown together with little thought, was regarded as primitive or Gothic. The irregular lines of the house, probably the result of the 11th century priory's adaptation to domestic use, were considered uncivilised. What fashion required of Sir Robert was a new family mansion, but first convention required him to get an education. And he completed, aged 15, at Christ Church College at the University of Oxford on December the 17th, 1684. Completing his grand tour in the 21-year-old 4th Baronet married Frances Thynne on August the 13th, 1690. I think it's probably Thynne pronounced. Her father was the first Viscount Weymouth, owner of Longleat House near Warminster. Through Lady Worsley, Sir Robert inherited the famous Essex ring, now in Westminster Abbey. Queen Elizabeth I had given the ring to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, with the intention of his returning it to her if he were ever in trouble, so that she could rescue him. And Devereux tried to send it back to her after being imprisoned in the Tower of London for rebelling against her, and he was executed in 1601. Sir Robert also inherited a lock of Devereux's hair, now kept at Ham House in Richmond upon Thames. Another family heirloom which Lady Worsley brought to Appuldurcombe was the Bedford Book of Hours, an illuminated 15th century prayer book produced for the wedding of John, Duke of Bedford, to Anne of Burgundy in 1423. It's now one of the British Museum's most treasured manuscripts. Perhaps Lady Frances had an indirect hand in the writing of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. One of her hobbies was japanning, or varnishing, as was popular at the time, and she japanned a wooden writing box which she presented to Swift, Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, who was a good friend of Sir Robert's. Perhaps the pen was used to write his most imaginative work came from that box, which is still kept at the Dublin Deanery. Sir Robert was appointed Deputy Lieutenant of Hampshire, which then included the Isle of Wight, in 1699, serving in the position until 1702. While they spent most of their time at Chiltern Candover across Surrey and Hampshire, documents refer to him as Sir Robert Worsley of Chiltern Candover as late as 1708. Appuldurcombe was a traditional Worsley family seat, so it was there that Sir Robert contemplated his new house. And there is a contemporary drawing of it, which you may have seen around the space that comes from Worsley's History of the Isle of Wight, published in 1781. And he annotated it with the line, Appuldurcombe as I found it in 1690, and of which I have not left one stone standing. It shows a haphazard Tudor mansion constructed around 3 sides of a central paved courtyard. So Sir Robert oversaw construction of the current house between 1701 and 1713. At the age of 42, all of his disposable income was spent, no doubt having been taxed to the nines to pay for ongoing war with France. And he was forced to leave the house incomplete. In all, his mansion cost £3,532, 15 shillings and 10 pence. While Sir Robert failed to complete the mansion, there was enough cash in the kitty in 1718 for Edward Webb to be paid for painting the smoking room, steward's room, passages and closets, chambers and attics. And in 1719, Thomas Crewe was paid for the first parcel of banisters, which came from London for the great staircase at Appuldurcombe. Towards the end of his life, Sir Robert wrote, I've done, for I must leave to the next stage, both the finishing of this house and the paying of my own debts, and that of the nation, for I see no prospect of it ever being done in my time. I've been at the labouring oar ever since I came of age, and must continue to my grave, and the plenty I remember in King Charles II's time during my minority makes the present prospect appear more melancholy. The fashioning his estate was not all that preoccupied Sir Robert. His political views were somewhat liberal. He was a Tory with Whiggish leanings who returned for Newtown as Member of Parliament on his own interest in 1715. By 1741, Sir Robert had money to spend on a classical-style monument to himself and his late brother, as I say, right through there. Sir Robert must have wanted to show gratitude as Sir Thomas, his younger brother, had left him his library. As long as the same shall continue to be enjoyed by any descendants from the family of Worsley, Sir Robert wrote. Sir Robert used Italian marble to rebuild the north transept, including marble busts of himself and his brother, with their initials carved above on a frieze. So Sir Robert also outlived his sons. His son Robert died in 1714, aged 19, and Thynne died in 1741, aged 30. When Sir Robert died in 1747, Appuldurcombe was inherited by his cousin, another Sir James Worsley, of Pilewoods Health in Lymington. And in his will, Sir Robert said, nothing of mine at Appuldurcombe except the plate shall be sold or removed, but remain there as heirlooms and go with the possession and inheritance of Appuldurcombe forever. He would get his dying wish for just a century. Either the next age, as Sir Robert called it, or the one after he completed Appuldurcombe, that honour would be claimed by Sir Richard Worsley, the last of the family to live at Appuldurcombe. Sir Richard became somewhat famous, and if you haven't heard about his story, you'll get a little bit of it here. His monument, at one stage, I've got this right, stood here.
Yes.
And later on, in Victorian times, it was moved behind the organ. And it's very hard to see the inscription on it. At one stage, it was deemed as quite, what's the right word? Locals nicknamed it the Bath. And a lot of people didn't like it, which is the main reason it was moved, I understand.
It was when the wall painting was uncovered. It was covered with whitewash to protect it from Cromwell and his mob. When that was discovered, they decided to restore that chapel. And when I first arrived here, one of the eldest members of the congregation could remember her grandmother telling her of watching the bathtub being levered up onto rollers and 8 cart horses drawing it to the back there. It weighs 30 tons, and of course it didn't weigh that when it came in because it was in pieces, but now it's together so it could take apart. So they put it back there and put the organ in front of it to hide it. I'm told it provides a good sounding board for the organ. Some people have asked if we baptise it and they know it's solid and health and safety wouldn't allow it anyway.
I'll just say, poor old Sir Richard. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit of his story. It was recently a subject of a BBC television drama and a best-selling book, which I have opinions on. But this is kind of my take on it. So Sir Richard Worsley was a collector of beautiful things. As a fellow of the Royal Society and fellow of the Society of Antiquarians, it is possible that he saw his wife, Seymour Dorothy Fleming, who he married on September the 15th, 1775, as the jewel in the crown of his collection. If Sir Joshua Reynolds' full-length portrait of Lady Worsley in a riding habit, adapted from Sir Richard's South Hampshire militia uniform, is anything to go by, Seymour was one of the most attractive women of the age. Sir Richard appeared in a similar Reynolds painting wearing his military uniform in 1774. 17-year-old Seymour, a darling of 18th century society, was the daughter of Sir John Fleming of Brompton Park in Middlesex. Sir John presented the 24-year-old Sir Richard with an £80,000 dowry with his daughter's hand in marriage. It seems Sir Richard had to wait 5 years for some of it, as records showed 20,000 of Lady Worsley's share in her late father's estate being used to buy into the Worsley estate in July 1779. Historian Edward Gibbon, very well known for his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was a great friend of the Worsleys, and he was snide about the wedding, saying Sir Richard had married, in quotes, for love and £80,000. If this was so, the love lasted only as long as the money, which was probably spent on completing Appuldurcombe and filling it with art. Seymour fell pregnant in 1776 and Robert Edwin Worsley was born. A daughter followed in August 1781. But it would have been impossible to prove Sir Richard was the father, since Seymour eloped with Captain George Bissett of Knighton House near Newchurch, just a few months after the daughter was born. John Hoss, I'm not sure who he was, but he wrote about Sir Richard. He said, "Sir Richard looks yellow, haggard and spiritless. I'm afraid he drinks more wine than does him good, and he has not half the regard to the season which his constitution at this time requires." On February the 21st, 1782, Bissett, a fellow officer in the South Hampshire militia, was found guilty of having, with force and arms, made an assault on Seymour and then and there debauched, deflowered, lay with and carnally knew her. Having heard the evidence at a King's Bench trial in Westminster Hall, London, the jury of 12 common men took nearly an hour to find Bissett guilty, but the hearing, presided over by William, Earl of Mansfield, was far from an open and shut case. Sir Richard employed England's most senior legal mind, Attorney General James Wallace, who explained a great friendship was fostered when Sir Richard gave Bissett a commission in his regiment the previous year. So these two men were great mates. On November the 18th, 1781, Lady Worsley had eloped with Bissett from Lewes, where Sir Richard had a house and Bissett had lodgings. They'd attended a party at the home of Captain Levisage, which Sir Richard had not attended due to ill health. Sometime around the 4 a.m, Sir Richard sent his servant, Francis Godfrey, to Levisage's house to ask Lady Worsley to come home. Shortly afterwards, Sir Richard appeared at the door asking after his wife. Lady Worsley had told Mr. Godfrey earlier in the evening if anybody came to inquire after her, to tell him that she should not sup at home that night. Sir Richard was very much agitated. Bissett's landlord, Mr. Stubbs, could not remember his tenant coming home, but had heard Bissett and somebody else leave the lodgings for a horse-drawn chase shortly after 4 a.m. Bissett and Lady Worsley had arrived at the Royal Hotel in London's Pall Mall at 2 p.m. on November the 19th. They ordered breakfast and retired to bed in room 14, according to waiter Thomas Bourne. "I took them to be man and wife," he said. "Did not know anything to the contrary." 5 days later, two of Sir Richard's servants had tracked the pair to the hotel, and Mrs. Command, who worked there, showed them to room 14. I introduced two of Sir Richard's servants, a woman and a groom, to Lady Worsley and Mr. Bissett while they were in bed. In the evening, Mr. Bissett sent for me into the dining room and desired to know the reason of showing such persons up as Sir Richard Worsley's groom into Lady Worsley's bedroom, and said it was much against the house to use ladies of quality in that manner. The jury must have been convinced at this part in the proceedings that Sir Richard had indeed been wronged both by his wife and by his friend. Indeed, Bissett's legal counsel, Mr. Deercroft, did not attempt to make any excuses for his client's behaviour, but he went on to claim that Sir Richard had excited and encouraged the affair. Deercroft said that the licentious conduct of Lady Worsley was so notorious that it had been the subject of common conversation. Many ladies of distinction had urged Sir Richard to have Lady Worsley modify her behaviour to something more becoming of a lady. Butchier Smith, who had met Sir Richard and Lady Worsley at a party in Shooters Hill in London in 1779, painted Sir Richard as someone who was no longer cared for his wife. The Marquess of Graham, who had known Lady Worsley for 3 or 4 years, but had never met Sir Richard, was next on the witness stand. He admitted being an infrequent visitor to Sir Richard's house, where Lady Worsley was gay, lively and free in her behaviour. Charles Wyndham revealed how Lady Worsley had presented him her gold wedding ring in Kensington Gardens. The defence closed its case with Dr. Osborne, who in August 1780 treated Lady Worsley for some complaints on her, which I fancy were the consequence of a venereal disorder. That's the doctor's words. Summing up the case, Lord Mansfield told the jury the single question was whether Sir Richard had been privy to the prostitution of his wife. The jury retired and after nearly an hour's debate returned with a verdict in Sir Richard's favour. The damages he received, however, amounted to 1 shilling on the grounds of his connivance. Robert I. Donkin probably made a small fortune out of the case using Fleet Street printers. Donkin published the trial with the whole of the evidence between Sir Richard and Bissett, and that went at least to its 8th edition. We're just going off script a little bit here, but it was kind of the Charles and Di scandal of the era. It's exactly what it was, and it's he said, she said. And I'm not a professional historian, I'm an amateur, but my summation of the case is she was a bit of a good time girl, and he was a complete opposite. He was a scholar and a historian and an antiquarian, and it was a very bad match. They should never have got married.
Except for the £80,000.
Except for the £80,000, which helped him tremendously. So yeah, I actually feel a lot of sympathy for poor old Sir Richard, but the books and the pamphlets and the TV film that was made painted him in a very bad light, and I actually don't think that he is as they portrayed him. But that's me, that's my opinion. Watch it and make up your own mind, that's what I'll say. So just finishing off, in a bid to escape the scandal, Sir Richard chartered a ship and embarked on a second grand tour. Architect Wiley Reveley was commissioned to record the trip in sketches and drawings. Leaving Rome in February 1785, Sir Richard embarked on an extensive journey in the Levant. The French consul in Athens, Gaspari, received them on May the 9th, from where they began their Greek tour, taking in Eleusis, Megara, where he paid a small sum for the statue of, forgive my Greek, Asclepius, priestess of Artemis, or Thosia. I'm not going to read all of that. A lot of, fantastic Greek, probably BC, statues made before Christ. At some point, the 10-year-old artist Joseph Malad William Turner joined them, adding to the pile of artwork Reveley was creating. Sir Richard and Reveley visited Sigium, Troy, and the Crimea in the spring of 1786, heading back to Rome in April 1787. He was away a long time collecting artworks and treasures from the ancient world. When he returned to Appuldurcombe, Sir Richard established a museum Wesleyan where he exhibited the most important collection of Greek marbles ever seen in England. That was from an expert that called it that. Appuldurcombe's collection was exhibited more than 2 decades before the now famous Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin, acquired his Greek marbles. The Worsley marbles were displayed alongside a set of antique gems Sir Richard had bought from Sir William Hamilton, the British envoy to Naples, archaeologist and husband of Admiral Lord Nelson's mistress, Lady Emma Hamilton. With his collection now occupying Appuldurcombe, open to the public inspection by prior appointment only, Sir Richard was joined by his housekeeper, Sarah Smith, at the Sea Cottage near St Lawrence Well, which he had built opposite his mother's house, Lyle Combe. So Sir Richard Worsley, the completer of Appuldurcombe, died at the Sea Cottage on August the 8th, 1805, from an epileptic fit. The day before he died, he drank 2 bottles of Madeira and a pint of brandy and had been accustomed to drink freely, said a commentator at the time. It seems Sir Richard's last days were with a police gibbon who grumpily criticised him for turning his back on his life as a wild English buck before his disastrous marriage. He died owing £50,000. To put that debt into context, all the Appuldurcombe paintings were initially valued at £25,000, but revalued by John Woodhouse 6 months later at just under £10,000. Appuldurcombe's marbles, statues, busts, vases, cameos, intaglios and bronzes, initially valued at about £1,600, and they were reassessed to be worth about £1,400. So Sir Richard was the last of the Worsleys of Appuldurcombe, and the house was inherited by his niece Henrietta, who was only 17, and she later on married the first Earl of Yarborough from Lincolnshire, and between them they used Appuldurcombe as a base, and he was one of the founders of the Royal Yacht Squadron at Cowes. So he entertained royalty on the Appuldurcombe estate. Queen Victoria was a frequent visitor, and the King as well at other times. But it was the Yarboroughs who built the monument to Sir Richard after his death, as I say, in there, and it's moved to there. So that's the end of my little talk. I'm happy to take any questions, and for those that don't know, we're heading to Appuldurcombe for about 1:30 for a tour there as well. And I won't talk so much about the people, I'll talk more about the building and the history and all the rest of it there. But any questions?
Yeah, all this stuff you collected, did that go to the Yarboroughs, or was it sent somewhere else?
Yeah, it went to the Yarboroughs, and when the Earl of Yarborough died in 1847, his son inherited, and they divided, then around 1855 the house went on, the whole estate went on the market in lots, and so all of it went back to Brocklesby Park in Lincolnshire.
Wonderful.
But then later on there was a sale in 1925, and some of it was sold, and the best was kept at Lincolnshire. But it's still there. Believe it or not, the Worsley collection is in the orangery, an external building in the gardens at Brocklesby Park. And
Some of it is at the bottom of the Mediterranean,
wouldn't be surprised.
because he thought, one of them, anyway, thought he would be treated well by Napoleon. And he had collected a whole lot of stuff, and then realised he wasn't going to be treated well by Napoleon, and tried to make a quick escape from Italy, and the ship sank with quite a lot of his collection.
Right. Yeah, Sir Richard did spend a lot of time overseas, as we talked, and during the French Revolution particularly, he bought a lot of paintings and art treasures from the fleeing lords of France. As Father John said, they wanted to make a quick escape with their head still on their neck.
Let's see. If anybody has 20,000 to spare, one thing that we'd both love to do is to have a proper ultrasound scan done at the church. There is an underground passage to what we know as the back swing, even though it's now called the Worsley, which used to be the parish gun house. You heard about each parish having to have a gun. That was right the way up through Napoleon times. Back swing, parish gun house. I think the underground passage started just outside the tower, for two reasons. One, the tower is the keep, in a sense, of the church and of the village. That's where the security was. And underneath the sail table there, the ground is hollow, you can hear it. So there's something under there. That's probably the entrance to that. But behind that wall there's an odd thickening at the base of the wall, which is of no architectural purpose whatsoever. But reading what one has read, one thinks that is probably the entrance, the old entrance to the Worsley tomb, which is very likely underneath the sanctuary there. I'm describing where they said some stones were dislodged from the Worsley tomb at the lightning strike. That is probably it, and that's the only explanation for it. So to do an ultrasound scan of the place would be lovely. Somebody else can pay for it.
Yeah, this all started with me emailing Father John saying, do you know where the Worsley vault is? Because I've visited the church a million times, and I know they're not buried out there, and I know some of them are in the ground here, under slabs.
Yeah.
But
it would be there. The reason why the Lees chose that place for their tomb, the wealthiest person in any area would always choose to be buried the closest to the high altar, because during the Easter ceremonies, during the watch of Maundy Thursday to Good Friday, a garden would be made inside the tomb and the Blessed Sacrament reserved there. And people thought that boded well for their afterlife if that happened. So that would have been the reason why they had it there, and they wanted to be very as close to that as possible. And it was probable that they took over the basic vault from the priors of Appuldurcombe anyway. So that was probably would have been where the priors would have been buried, would have been under the high altar. So that is the most probable space. But a scan would allow it. When we had the west wall done, they wanted to do the entire scan, but we couldn't afford it. We only had the west wall done. But if anybody would like to donate, I mean,
Yeah, it'd be great to solve that mystery.
Chris and Father, we're just about to start a scan at Northwood House because we've lost the entrance to the ward mausoleum on St Mary's.
yes.
There's a minor project we're trying to put together at the moment. One of the things to look at Richard Worsleys Tower. I'll talk to Chris offline, but we'll see if we can. To Southampton University, so we ground penetrating radar. We're also looking for the lost tunnels at Northwood House, of which there are several.
Yes.
We know where they are, we're not too sure exactly where they are. So it would be good fun to put this into the
Put it into their thoughts, yes.
offline, and we'll let you know if we can do it.
Excellent.
Yeah. I mean, I spent my whole adult life joining the dots. I'm still joining some dots, you know. If we can join some more dots here, that'd be wonderful. You had a question?
Prior to the Worsleys being at Appuldurcombe,
Yeah.
who were at Appuldurcombe prior to the Worsleys?
Right, well, yeah,
Have you researched that?
I have, yeah. Very, very briefly, first of all, the area is prehistoric, and there is
It's a very fertile valley.
exactly, very fertile. So it's prehistoric, and so there was human settlement there from, you know, the beginning of time, if you like. There's tumuli, ancient prehistoric burial ground on the top of the downs around by the obelisk, a bit further along. If you know what you're looking for, there's lots of people buried up there. So there we go, we know that there were people there then. I recently learned from an archaeologist friend that some Roman remains have been found at Appuldurcombe as well. So I didn't know about that, but it doesn't surprise me because when they built the Wroxall to Ventnor tunnel over at the end of Manor Road in Wroxall, and in the 1860s, from memory, they discovered a whole hoard of Roman coins. So Wroxall is Roman, or at least was Roman. And then we have the monks that came in 1090 from France and built the priory house there. Well, built the priory, which eventually was turned into a house. And then we have the Fry family. So the Fry family were there for a very short time, and they were leasing, after the monks left, as a
Sorry, did you say Brown family?
Fry family.
Yes, to fill in on the monks, when William the Conqueror conquered the island, he divided it into parishes with straight lines north and south. This was the first parish to be subdivided because it was the best and most fertile farming land. So there was a dense population here, and he gave all the parishes to two abbeys in Normandy. They built their outstations to look after the parishes at Appuldurcombe and at Carisbrooke. That continued until the suppression of foreign monasteries, when Appuldurcombe was given to nuns minoresses without Aldgate, and they didn't need it, hence the renting to them until the final suppression of all monasteries.
Right. So the Fry family were the first to rent it from the nuns, and then, as we sort of talked about a little bit earlier, right at the beginning, we had Sir John Lee marrying into the Fry family, and then you had Sir James Worsley, Henry VIII's whipping boy, marrying into the Lee family and obtaining Appuldurcombe for that roughly 300 years. Yeah.
So is your book going to be available to purchase?
One day. Yes, I hope to. And I'm not sure yet about publishers and all the rest of it. So my main job at the moment is finishing it. I've been writing it for 10 years from New Zealand, where I live, with my lovely wife and 3 children. It's my little link to the island that's keeping me, you know, because I love it here, obviously, but I love New Zealand as well. So it's about 95% finished. It covers from the beginning of time through to 1986 when I was a boy there, and I've still got to do the next little bit from 1986 to modern day, and then I've actually got still a lot of books with reference in that I haven't even had a chance to get into yet. But I suspect, if I'm realistic, I might get it finished at the end of this year, if I really work hard every night.
If I could put a plug for this, History of Godshill, parish and village. It's got chapters, many chapters on the Worsleys, Appuldurcombe and all the rest of it. It was written by a schoolmaster who lived down the road and edited by our previous treasurer and myself, because otherwise it would be that thick, the large repetition. And it's available either from us or from Italy.
Fantastic.
It is very interesting, and one of the advantages I have, which you don't, is that as I have it on disk, I can press search and get what I want.
So useful. So yeah, so as I say, this is my book. It's about 214 pages of A4 at the moment. It's about 120,000 words, which is roughly a novel, large novel size, a paperback novel. So it's probably the most in-depth study of Appuldurcombe ever done. But there is a little more to do, and I'll just keep going until I run out of avenues to pursue.
So to your knowledge, who were the last people to leave Appuldurcombe?
When you say leave,
To leave, because during the war there was you obviously know this, there was a landmine dropped nearby, and I can remember as a child, because the place was empty, going to Appuldurcombe. It was just a ruin at the time, and you could go down to the cellars, the wine cellars, etc. Anyway, so was it actually empty when the bomb was
sure.
the
So,
mine was dropped?
and I'll talk about this a bit more at Appuldurcombe when we get there. But the monks, a new set of monks came to Appuldurcombe in 1901,
Yes.
and they left around 1909. They went to Croix, and then the house was empty. It was requisitioned during both of the wars.
Yeah.
Not found any of the records for that requisitioning. Basically, it was used for war effort, and I tracked down a Canadian lieutenant who died recently. He was quite old when he died, who was training for D-Day there, and they stayed at the house for 10 days in October 43, about 6 months after the mine, and he told me his story of how they were basically doing what they called a military, what was the word? Anyway, they were doing an exercise there. The scenario was that Appuldurcombe was in an enemy territory, and as Allied troops, they were scouting the area and defending it against the enemy. And so they set up a camp. They lived in part of the house, but it was in quite a bad state, and they also had tents in the grounds.
Yeah.
So I think Robert Gray was his name, and he may have been the last person to stay in the house before it was stripped. But I'm going to confess that while they were restoring it in '86, some friends and I nipped up there and slept in the house just after the roof went on. Just had to do it. So, we knew what time people would arrive on site, so we left before anybody caught us. That's me. What a great childhood I had.
You're going to start your
Yes.
tour at 1:30, I think.
Absolutely, we need to get on the road. So anybody that wants to join us, please.